Well, hello, folks. Very warm welcome to the first of the video version of the blogs. A number of you who followed Unintended Consequences for quite a long time have said, well, why don't you do some short clips to camera? Talk about some of the things you feel strongly about under the same banner heading and keep them short and sweet, and we'll see where we go. So without further ado, for this inaugural first video, or is it really a film these days? I'm never quite sure, but anyway, we want to talk a little bit about Afghanistan. You may feel like there's a lot been already written and published, and there's a lot of footage across pretty much all the Western media channels. I just want to go back to one or two of the first principles of the problem that we now face and the cause of that problem. Some of this, as ever, may be controversial, and as always, I love to see your comments, love to answer your comments, and just get a healthy debate going, because let's face it, a healthy debate is the basis of any democracy. So let's unpack this. The first thing I want to ask you to do is just turn the camera around 180 degrees on the situation in Afghanistan for the last 20 years. In fact, we could track back way beyond 20 years if we include the involvement of the Russians 30 to 40 years ago. So you're a citizen, you're a law-abiding Afghani citizen, and really unless you're really quite advanced in years, all you can remember is being subject to two things. First of all, foreign military occupation, and second of all, a government that effectively was the tool of the Western Allied powers, and therefore in the eyes of many of you, possibly not a legitimate government. And the reason for switching the camera around is, of course, to explore how we would all feel if we woke up tomorrow morning with a foreign military force walking our streets, carrying live ammunition and weapons, informing where we go when we go there, what we do when we get there, installing a government to rule us that was not our democratic choice, may not represent our religious, economic, social views at all. And I think you'd find very quickly that we would be rebelling, we would be incredibly uneasy with the direction of travel for our own country and our own lives. And I think that's how we have to look at the speed of the recent takeover, if you will, by the Taliban, to also now be forming a government in less than 1 month. The recording of this film is currently the middle of September 2021, so less than 4 weeks ago, the main cities in Afghanistan fell, as did most of the territories, to the Taliban. Now, could that happen? Would it happen without at least the passive, or indeed in some cases tacit, support of the Afghani population? Let's bear in mind here, this is a population of 35 to 40 million people. Could that happen purely on fear alone? And I wager that it could not. I wager that this is a predominantly conservative form of Islam throughout this country. We have a tendency to simply describe the Taliban always as some threatening, horrendous force. And of course, there are many parts of their version of Islam that we find perhaps in the West difficult to work with, to listen to imagine. But again, we must return to the point, but we expected the people of Afghanistan for the last 20 years to work with, to accept Allied military forces on their soil, year in, year out, month in, month out. So perhaps to that middle-of-the-road Afghani wanting a simple, easy life without the interference of really anyone, maybe the idea of conservative Islam, maybe the idea of the Taliban forming what could prove to be a legitimate government through the lens of being an Afghani could actually be something that the country would wish to see more than a continued Western military involvement. And I think this whole concept that I'm describing here in the film today is incredibly poorly reported by the Western media, where the fundamental mood music is that the Western forces have tried to do good, have tried to ensure that women receive the same rights as men, including education, etc., all of which are laudable aims. But in truth, is that actually what the majority of Afghanis wanted? Did they want Western forces, Western governments ruling their country, telling them which crops to grow, telling them how to behave, and all of the other things that we, as Westerners, have tried to inculcate into the Afghani society in the last 2 decades? My suspicion is that for most people, they may not be aggressive, patriotic supporters of a Taliban-led force and government. But that doesn't mean that they are any more supportive of continued Western involvement. So that leads us then to the actual decision to exit, particularly, let's face it, created by the Americans, and the execution of that exit. Well, we can see significant challenges, of course, in front of us from the execution of that exit. But actually, to me and to my mind, that isn't the fundamental problem here. The fundamental problem was that we were there in the first place. We were trying to create a nation state. We were trying to, yet again, carry out what had been so many times before a flawed mission by Western governments and forces to try to effectively tell another country how to live and how to govern itself. So I think the problem here is not so much the exit, it was the fact we shouldn't have been there in the first place, that we shouldn't have engaged as we did. The shifting sands of why we were there, from the reaction to 9/11, and I'm actually recording this piece on the 20th anniversary of 9/11, and hence the relevance of the topic. We essentially believe that that gave us legitimacy for military takeover, military force for decades to come. I can see no good reason and no good outcome. And we've had, let's face it, ladies and gentlemen, plenty of times before where we've tried and failed. So I think for sure there are people who've collaborated with the Western forces. There are other individuals who would consider themselves to be a great threat, who would legitimately wish to leave Afghanistan. And we have a huge responsibility to finish the lifting of people who don't wish to be there and to try all diplomatic means possible to finish the job there. But we shouldn't be under any illusion that means the whole country wishes to leave. I don't believe that. I see no evidence at all of that. By the way, that doesn't mean that I would not wish the United Kingdom and other allied forces to provide safe harbour for those who do wish to return. It is the smallest thing we should do after having caused many of the problems and issues that Afghanistan has suffered in the last 2 decades or more. The derisory amounts of people put into official resettlement programs, I think the UK's program is 20,000 people, is nowhere near enough to actually deal with the issue. But to repeat, that there should be no illusion here that all of Afghanistan wishes to leave. This is not the same situation as we saw in Syria. This is not escalated to that pitch at all. It is not sponsored in the same way that the breakdown of Syria was sponsored by its own leader. So to summarise, ladies and gentlemen, lest we forget how we would feel had we experienced, as the Afghanis have for the last 2 decades, the day-to-day impact, limitations and controls on our behaviours, lest we forget what that feels like and think hard about whether we would behave in certain ways. How would we react to that type of impact on our daily lives? I wish Afghanistan, its people, I wish its newly appointed starting government success in trying to rebuild a manageable climate for all citizens to live. And I implore Western governments to think again about their resettlement programs for those who do wish to leave and have good reason to leave. I implore you to provide safe harbour for those individuals and enable us to move back to a position where we can do business with and diplomatically engage with Afghanistan as we do most other nations in the world. Thank you, people. Episode 2 coming very soon.